Hi and welcome to this new episode of the GMMP interview series. I'm Yanni Lunga, and in today's episode I'm joined by the Associate Professor of the Department of Journalism, Media and Communication at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, Dr. Maria Edström. We're gonna cover a lot of ground today, and you can find all of the notes related to this episode as well as related to the previous episodes of this interview series, the interview with Dr. Sarmacharya and Dr. Philip Lee. You can find everything if you go to the following link, jo.my/GMMP. Simply enter that link into your web browser and you'll be redirected to the page concerning this show and the GMMP research project. Okay, it's time to get started. Here is the conversation with Dr. Maria Edström. I'm excited to be sitting down with you because I know we have quite some ground to cover. And I think the first question I should ask you is actually has to do with the work that you've done recently with Professor Monica Dierpierre. You have published a book that is called Comparing Gender and Media Equality Across the Globe. And in the book, one of the concepts you cover and you introduce is the concept of the GEM index. So could you take a moment to share what the GEM index is all about?
We felt that there are a lot of different indexes or indicators for gender equality in the media, but it sometimes is like that every, say, news industry have their own measurements, or if they don't, maybe. But even if you need to kind of be able to compare various countries and maybe newsrooms without it being so complicated. So we wanted to see if we could have a theory-based and very well-grounded way of doing it, super easy way to measure gender equality in the media. So Monica and I worked on this. Primarily Monica done a lot of statistical analysis on finding the right variables. And our idea was that how do you measure gender equality in the media? It has to do with presence, if women are there or not, as news subject, but also as reporters. So that was one thread, so to speak. And then we also wanted to know where are the women in terms of news subjects. And as we know, politics and economy and business are those areas that are kind of high status. So we said, like, the level of where are the women in these topics would be a very interesting thing to put into our index. And then it also has to do with what roles do women and men have in the news media, and whether you are an expert or you're a spokesperson, or are you just have a personal opinion on something. So those three areas of like presence, roles and topics are the ones that we have now merged into a very easy index that is in our data set, but you can also do it on your own newsroom and do the counting and come up with a measurement that you can then compare with other countries or other newsrooms.
Okay, so different, let's say, angles to look at gender coverage in the media. You said it's not only about the physical presence, but also in which context. And I'm gonna ask you another question related to the GM index in a moment, Maria. But first I want to ask you about your involvement in the GMMP project. How did you start getting involved with the project, number one? And number two, could you also take a moment to discuss what the GMMP project actually focuses on?
I got in touch with the GMMP when I was a PhD student. And at that time, I was also involved. We had started a media watch group in Sweden called Everything is Possible. and we had ourselves also been doing a study, like before I was a PhD student, me and a colleague, we did a study on the media buzz, whose presence in the media in general. kind of similar to the GMMP, but we didn't know about that study. We did it in 1994, and the first GMMP came in 95, but we weren't aware that work was going on. But once we heard about it after the Beijing Platform for Action conference and everything, we said we want to be involved. So we started this collaboration between this Media Watch Group and the University of Gothenburg, and we started doing the Swedish data collection in 2000. And since then, every 5 years, have been involved. So it's the 5th time now that Sweden has been part of the GMMP. And the GMMP stands for Global Media Monitoring Project, and it's about taking a snapshot of the news media around the world during one day. So everyone collects in the same manner who is present in the news and what are the topics and a lot of other things. And that measurement has been done now since 95. So it's a long time series, and more countries get involved like every 5 years. So soon we will have like a total mapping of the world. It's still countries missing, of course, but it gives a good idea on what's going on in the news media.
Thank you for sharing that with all of us, Maria. And what would you say? I said earlier when we talked about the GEM index that I was going to bring it back into the conversation for a moment. And I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts in terms of what you see as the impact of the GMMP on the GEM index? Is there a certain impact or even a couple of different impacts on the index, in your opinion?
We use the GMMP to kind of develop the index. And you might say that once now we launched the book and we launched the data set and the index, that's kind of day 0. And now we will see if people will use it or not. And in the book, we give examples of both how we developed it and what it says. And that's what the book is about, is giving example of how you can do more advanced analysis on gender media by using our data set that we have curated. So our data set is the primary like gender data we have, gender media is the GMMP, and then it's the IWMF study on newsrooms, and then it's the AGE study on the media organizations within the European Union. So those 3 data sets are about almost the only ones that we found that actually do measurements comparative between countries, because there are a lot of studies that involve maybe 10 countries or 5 countries, or you do a single country analysis, and we wanted to do this that you should be able to compare on a larger scale. Mm-hmm. And then you don't have that many studies on gender and media, and that's why the GMMP is so important, because it covers so many countries and it's been going on for so long.
Okay, so there are different studies, different components that are intertwined. Mm-hmm. And you talked about different countries. You being based in Sweden, I want to ask you a question related to the Nordic countries, and feel free to expand on it even beyond just the Nordic countries. But since you are based in Sweden, you've been involved working with the Nordic countries, what would you say has been the impact of the GMMP on the Nordic countries? Because for me, for example, being originally from Switzerland, I think that in many parts of the world, or even in many parts of Europe, people tend to look at the Nordic countries and they think, those are the ideal countries where gender equality has been really achieved. So keeping that comment in mind, or even that bias to some degree in mind, what would you say, Maria, or has been the impact on the GMMP on the Nordic countries?
I mean, I'm raised in this, that before we used to be very, not equal, but now we live in an equal society. And then if not in school, you will find out when you start working that you have a lot to work to do still, right? And you can see on so many levels that we are on the top level of the, say, those gender gap indexes and those kind of things. Mm-hmm. So on certain levels we are gender equal as society, but when you go to the media, there are many studies that show that the media is lagging behind, in the sense that the experience and the knowledge from women are not present. And that goes all over the Nordic countries. So that's not such a difference, but there's kind of a gap between the societal level of gender equality and how it is kind of represented in the media, especially the news media. But that said, it's also something interesting in the Swedish, and I think also in the Nordic countries, is that in Sweden we have a very divided labor market where men work in certain areas and women work in certain areas. But there are also some parts of the labor market that are gender equal, and that is the media industry, where you have kind of 50-50 representation in the workplace. And I think maybe some journalists tend to think that, well, we are gender equal here at our work, so then our product will be gender equal, and that is not so, because I think you also need some knowledge about the society and what's going on in terms of gender equality in order to do a gender equal reporting. So there is this kind of gap. But what we find when we do this more advanced analysis on a global scale, we can see that the countries that are more gender equal also tend to have more gender equality levels in the media. So when we look at the GMMP, for instance, the Nordic countries have been, quite high, like Finland and Sweden, been around 30% women in the news. But I mean, if you think 30% is balanced, it's not very balanced, right? So you can always discuss, is balance 50-50 or is balance 40-60 and so on, but it's certainly not this 30. So that's like so GMMP is an indicator that, something is lagging behind in the news media. And then the usual criticism to the GMMP is that, oh, it's just one day. What can you say about one day? And that is certainly true for one country, one day. But these global patterns seem to be really stable. And if you look from 95 to now, you can see that it seems like the news media is so based on routines. So you have like a certain setting every day. So it could be that one event would really alter something that day, but really in the bigger picture it doesn't. So I think our study and our book shows also that the GMMP is a very important resource to understand what's going on in the news media.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting to listen to what you just told us, especially keeping the 30% number in mind. And as you said, if we think that that's kind of on the high end of the spectrum, it really does mean that there is a need for some work to be done to change the current status quo. And I also found fascinating when you talked about some people, institutions that may argue, well, the GMMP focuses on one day. What does that really say, that snapshot? And it would be interesting to see if things change on certain days. For example, as I was listening to you, I was wondering what the snapshot would look like for a day like International Women's Day, for example. Would that be a day where we would see perhaps even a sort of shift in the proportion in terms of male presence and female presence, just because it's a day that it's quote unquote recognized to be a day that celebrates women? It's a question that popped up in my head and would be interesting to see. Or do you happen to...
Yes, how do the news media cover International Women's Day? Because that is usually a day where you think, oh, we have to, put women in the newspaper.
Right.
So that would be, at least you would get 50-50 for sure. And some newspapers also decide to have only women that day. But that becomes kind of also a strange way of doing reporting, that you should have one day for older people and one day for migrants or one day for this, and instead of kind of having a better mix. Because, I mean, the idea of talking about representation is in the news is about what you call politics of presence. And we talk about journalism of presence, that if you're there, you're counted and your voice matters. And if you're not there, you're not important. That's kind of what the news media said, what is on the top left corner or on the news front page is usually the most important and so things. So if you're never there, or topics that are never there, they become kind of maybe not so important for people in real life.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point. I think it's always important to keep that at the back of our minds. And I'm curious if I can ask you a sort of quote unquote personal question. What is it that sparked your interest in journalism and in gender in the media? Was there something in particular that kind of attracted you to those areas and the intersection of those two areas?
I have a background as a journalist, and I got into that I think I'm a curious person, and working as a journalist, you can ask anyone whatever question and to anyone, and I thought that was a kind of fascinating profession. And while working on in journalism, I'm also started to get involved covering those kind of gender equality stories, and you learn more and more, and you realize this kind of gap of what you've learned about society and journalism in journalism school, and what you experience. And from that side, my way into this was actually from this Media Watch group that me and a number of colleagues, we were in advertising or film and journalism, and we just felt that we were kind of part of the problem, that we kind of also produced these stereotyped images of people, whether it was migrants or women or children, and we just kind of wanted to kind of first kind of understand our part in this, how do you say, like these stereotypes are so practical to use, but they have this kind of power dimension that kind of affects people. So while starting this Media Watch group, we also realized there's a lack of knowledge, and we couldn't find relevant studies, what we wanted to know. So that's when we did this media bus studies to kind of get an overview. What does it look like in Sweden? That was our first, and we looked at the images in advertising, journalism, fiction, and so on. And after that study, I decided to go into research, so I became a Ph.D. student, and then I did my thesis on basically the same thing: the struggle for visibility of gender and power elites. It was an elite study, and so it was many different things that led me to this. But I'm very happy about this because we already in the 90s, we had this dimension that of like a broad representation. So we worked on age and ethnicity and gender and functionality, and also this if you're from the countryside or from the city. And throughout my kind of research career, I've been able to kind of come back to those kind of issues. That I mean, it's a privilege to have been following these kind of topics for so long, because you realize it goes up like and down, the interest, of course, but also the impact in certain times. Like now you have this Black Lives Matter in the US, but that kind of connects very well to older. You can go back to the 60s or the 90s, or that you have different waves of engagement. And the same thing I think goes for gender equality, that you think, well, now we reached the gender equality, there's no problem. And you can see it in the Me Too movement. All of a sudden you have this Me Too in 2017, and then in some of the countries, like I don't know if you're aware that it was a big thing in Sweden, Me Too, but not so big in Denmark. But now this autumn 2020 has been exploded kind of in Denmark 3 years later. So it's the same phenomena, but it kind of gets highlighted in various times in various ways. And I just find it very interesting to be part of this exploration of the role of the media in terms of how we live in society. Because I think I mean, the media is supposed to kind of mirror what's going on, but it's really not. It's news is about choices, and you choose one story above another. And if you want to kind of understand what's going on and how can people live their lives, I mean, the media is part of every person's life these days. So it's very important what's been, screened and monitored and explored in the media.
Yeah, absolutely. And then presented back to to the readers or the viewers or
Yeah.
the listeners. And one thing that really intrigues me about you specifically is what you told us, that you come from a journalistic background, and as you said, you were sort of, or you felt as if you were part of the quote unquote problem, and then you started to think, you and some of your colleagues started to think about, okay, how can we explore this further, and how can we try to actually take a snapshot of the status quo, present it to researchers, and really try to actually become the solution, or at least part of the solution. And one question that I think it's important for me to ask you, in case there is somebody watching or listening to us and is asking him or herself about the importance of actually looking at and studying gender representation in the media buzz. Why do you think it's actually an important topic to put emphasis on and reflect upon?
I think for me it was important to starting with gender, but I think you could basically start where you have your heart, whether it's on generations, age, or if it has to do with race or ethnicity, or if it have to do with city or countryside issues, like whatever kind of area that you feel like, why are these stories not in the news media? And if you kind of engage in that kind of dimension, you will see that all the other issues kind of intersect each other, and in some parts it's very important age, and in some parts it's very important the gender, and so on. And so it's like, I think it is about, if you're in the media industry, to kind of learn more so you can do better stories. But I think also as a media user, you can kind of better reflect or distance or understand the stories that you find, that it's kind of this it's very enlightening, and I think it helps you to understand the world and yourself if you kind of get into these issues, because you always have a gender or a sexuality or an age, even though if you don't think about it. And also in the relation with other people, you will always be kind of looked upon as someone, or people use the stereotypes, the images in our heads to kind of categorize people, and categorization is necessary in the world because otherwise you get too tired. But you have to be aware when those categorization also follows a kind of discriminatory or prejudice patterns that impacts, your relations.
Yeah, and I think especially as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking also about the extension of what, for example, consuming a news piece or a story means today. If it was some 10, 15 years ago, we were just sort of passive consumers of the content, whereas today we actually may take a certain story and make it a topic of conversation with, I don't know, our friends on Facebook or on Twitter or something like that. So I think that what you just told us, it's really important, especially for the fact that you introduced into the conversation also the role of the content consumer, whether we are readers, viewers, or listeners. That doesn't really matter. It's important to really keep these aspects in mind. And some of the conversation we've been having has focused on gender representation in the news space, in journalism, and we also kind of talked about media a little bit. If we were to sort of differentiate the two, so if we were to look at gender representation in the news field and in the media field, whatever other aspects we can put into media, are there some differences that you may have noticed in between gender representation in journalism versus in media?
I would say that the news media is kind of more traditional. They have very strong formats, like you have foreign news, national news. The national state is very important in the news. So they are very like old routines that are not so easily changed. Whereas if you work, say, in the film industry, your fiction is only your mind that is your limit, and you could change this gender representation. I was at a seminar where Gina Davis said we could fix this in 7 years. I mean, because that's like how to change all the production. It's like you're not bound to anything, but the news media is bound to cover maybe power representatives and in politics, there are not so many women maybe in some countries, or in the industry, like what you cover, you always ask the question to a male elite person and so on. You can't really change that. But what I would like to say is that in research we talk about this intertextuality, that kind of when you have like something going on in fiction, it kind of travels to the news and back and forth. And the concept of the country Wakanda, that is a fictional country, but that has had this huge impact in other, like in sports, people do the greeting and things like that. And then it becomes news. So it also is not that news is separate from the others. But I would like to mention that like our book and Dataset is open access, so is also this book that we did. It's called Making Change, Nordic Examples of Working Towards Gender Equality in the Media. And that was a couple of years before we got this funding for this data set that is, and our book is completely like research-based. But this book, Making Change, it was funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers, and it was a project at Soc&Kom where I worked at the time. And we wanted to kind of see what's going on in the Nordic countries in terms of gender equality in the media, in film, advertising, journalism, and gaming, because to kind of cover the broad media sphere where we all are, because we use media maybe 6 hours a day on radio, television, gaming, whatever, and you have these representations of people, like who are you killing in your game, and or who are you like, what kind of avatar do you choose, and so on. So it was a really fun and interesting project where we kind of connected researchers with industry people, activists, and single initiatives, and kind of tried to bring forward the good examples of things going on in the Nordic countries, because as we started talking about that, we actually have a high level of gender equality and there are people engaged in these issues. And so there are actually a lot of interesting initiatives being done, but you don't always know about them, because even though outside the Nordic countries, you kind of lump them together. But I mean, just because I live in the Nordic part of the world, I don't speak Icelandic or Finnish, so I don't know about the interesting gaming things going on in Finland and so on. So we made the book in English in order to kind of reach out within the Nordic countries, but also outside, to actually show that sometimes we are the front runners on gender equality, that we have been exploring. Like the Swedish film industry has been very successful in kind of promoting this idea about 50-50 by 2020, that you kind of by funding and other measures and mapping and so on, create maybe a different situation. But one of the big things in that book was also that we wanted to map what are the statistics, what do we know, how many editors-in-chief are there, how many directors and producers in film and so on, and that turned out to be really difficult to find any data, and that's something that kind of signifies the whole media area, that both like through commitments to the UN and to the EU and so on, you're supposed to deliver sex disaggregated data, but in terms of the media, that's a huge lack of data. So one of the results of that book, that we don't have enough data and it's not compiled in a way that you can use it. And that's why our research program has been so fantastic. It is funded by the Swedish Research Council, but what we have done is actually like creating a resource for the whole world. So it's based in Sweden, but it's, I mean, all the countries that have data through the GMMP, IWMF, and AE can use this data, and you can just download it to your computer and start doing your own analysis and adding on other information. And that's what we have in the book. For example, Sarah Macharia, who written a chapter on women in the labor market and women in the news and in economy and business journalism. She used the ILO data set together with our data set, and then she can see all these really interesting patterns, and that's the way how we hope to go about it in the future. We hope that people who are maybe not so much into media will take into account the role of the media when looking at progress or development in society, because I don't know if you're aware, but the Sustainable Development Goals that are, the global agenda for everyone right now, the word media is not mentioned, or press freedom and those kind of things. And if you're into the media industry, you of course think that media freedom, press freedom, freedom of information, and the role of the media is hugely important. And you will find it in the preamble where you kind of the Beijing for platform is important. That you kind of have all these Declaration of Human Rights and so on, but you have to have read those and know that the media is part of. You have Article 19 and you have Section J in the Beijing Platform for Action. But like if you don't know it, you will not find the wordings. And so our fear has been a little bit that we've seen that the media issues have been gliding out of the global agenda, that the media is not part of the solution or the problem. It's kind of a separate unit that you shouldn't kind of address. And that is of course for good reason. And Sweden and Finland, Nordic countries has this strong standpoint on freedom of expression that is so important, and that state parties should not involve in the media, and so the media should be independent, and that's very important to kind of stand up for that. But on the same time, a little bit of media monitoring, collecting data to see where are we, wouldn't be so wrong, I think. And there are many things you could do without interfering into the media industry. But I think that fear of kind of that any state party involvement in the media industry would be like an interfering of freedom of expression is, I think, a little bit of a misunderstanding, because you could also think about it of this is about expanding freedom of expression, so more voices will be heard, and you have to think differently of who has the right to this freedom of expression and who can be part of the public conversation. And that's why I think it's interesting when you see like that countries like Spain or France, I mean, they done some altered, the monitoring and demands that media kind of report back on how they're doing on these stories. So I mean, there are things happening in some countries that are interesting to see where it goes.
Thank you for sharing that with us. I'll make sure to actually add the link to the book as well as everything else we have been discussing in this interview in the show notes page, so the web page that goes along with this interview. Now, before we wrap things up, I would have a couple of final questions for you, Maria. One has actually to do with the role of age. When we talk about gender representation, because you touched upon it, you said that, well, gender representation is just one of the factors, one of the things. There is the role of or the presence of minorities, there is age. So if we look at gender representation specifically and the age as the two are connected, is there some preliminary findings you have actually identified when it comes to the media space?
Yes, I think I've done a couple of studies where we looked at how age is present in both the news but in the media buzz in general. And what you can see is that children and older persons are, the most invisible groups. And I think that has to do, when we talk about news, it's that the news industry are so focused on people that are in the age of kind of a potential labor market. So in Sweden, that would be, between 20 or 50, 60, something like that. And those are the people that they talk about and they think about. And that is also the same age as you have as a reporter. That is your network and your life. And you have the problem with your, whatever it is in your life. So it's kind of, the news media is mirroring the age groups of the reporters also, and with a fixed. I mean, we are privileged in the Nordic countries that we have a welfare system that gives us pension and retirement, but it also like once you're retired, you're like a nobody for the news. They don't want to talk to you, kind of, and I think those kind of so there are very. And if you combine that with a prejudice idea of what aging means and what it means to grow old in the society, that combination makes the media very, I would say they have a lot to learn when it comes to cover various age groups. And I think the whole COVID situation in the world kind of also really put the spotlight on this problem of how do we think about older people, how are they represented, and do they have a voice in the media? And I think that if and this have kind of also impacted how you talk about older people during COVID, because I mean we all know that older people are more affected by COVID, but the restrictions that you have laid upon older people and the kind of the measures that you think there are adequate and so are maybe based on prejudice on age that are kind of fueled by the media. I'm not saying it's the media's fault or anything, but like the ideas that are circulating about aging doesn't help to create a better situation. There's this gender dimension. I forgot to say that. That how they intersect. That if you're a younger woman, you're much more likely to be part of the media scene, and if you're an older woman, you're absolutely not interested. But also, if you're an older man, I mean, you tend to kind of after 50, there are not that many women, and it's like you have a youth capital to kind of invest in the media that you kind of communicate by your youth that is very strong. And of course the news media want things that are new and young and fresh, and so they get their hopes to the young new reporters and so on.
Yeah, I as I've listened to you, I kind of, from on the one hand, especially the latest comment you made, I'm thinking, well, yes, it makes sense to give opportunities to the younger generation and so forth. But then on the other hand, it also feels really sad to think, as you said, that basically after we pass a certain age, we become invisible in the media. I think it's really sad. And you said there are exceptions, like now with the case of COVID, where all of a sudden the media wants to bring back the older generation into the conversation, and from a point of view that isn't necessarily a positive, I dare to say.
I think also one problem is that the kind of that you think of segment or target groups that we're aiming for the 40 plus people or 30 plus people, and in real life you want to have a kind of interaction between generation, and you have in your life you have people with many ages, and if you only learn from your small segment in the news or on those series that you don't have this intergenerational conversation going on in the media, which I think is very important, especially in these days, because you also find a lot of prejudice against young people, that they don't care about COVID, that they just go out on the streets anyway and so on. So you kind of, are you fueling more prejudice against age groups, or are you kind of trying to bridge them and get an understanding? And what is the role of the media here?
It's a very good question. I think it could spark an entire conversation. I like it, and I would like everybody who's been here with you and I to really actually reflect on that for a moment. Now, to wrap things up, I would like to ask you, I'm gonna combine the two questions. The first part is, how do you personally see the impact of your role in the GMMP on your own research? How has being part of the GMMP has impacted your research? And then the second part of the question is if there is anything, any final words, any final comments, or any final questions you would like to share here in this interview.
Well, for me, the impact of being part of GMMP is almost like being part of a global community, and see how you can work, with the kind of grassroots movement, to researchers, to activists, that because you have to understand that the GMMP is almost completely a voluntary project, that people just engage in this because they think it's important, and how you can combine the experience of the researchers with people who have never done coding and so on. So it's just like a fantastic way of getting people together across the world, and that you every 5 years know that you voluntarily go into this project to kind of raise the awareness and level of knowledge on gender equality in the media. I think is fantastic. And then even more now that we hope that we can also bring into the GMMP 2020 into our data set, and we curate it and fix it so it can be easily used for all research around the world. It also kind of makes it even more important that we actually collect this data and do this. So and I think it kind of increases your learning also about like what does it mean that you don't take part, or you don't have freedom of expression, you don't have that high level of gender equality, and you don't take part of the studies, and you don't know what's going on. So this thing with that knowledge is kind of liberating is maybe the takeaway, that the more you learn and the more you can kind of understand what's going on, the freer you become, and you have a possibility to be a change agent wherever you are.
I think those are powerful words to conclude this interview with. I want to thank you once again, Maria Edström, for your time, for your insights, and really for what you do with the GMMP project and your research, and really in helping all of us understand a little bit more about what's happening in the media, what's happening in the journalistic field, especially as we've discussed in this interview when it comes to gender equality. So thank you again.
Thank you. My pleasure to be part of this effort.
Okay, we are back in the studio. A big thank you, tack, to Dr. Maria Edström. In case this was the first episode you listened to, I would like to remind you that there are other parts of this interview series. You can find them, more content, more resources, and more information about the GMMP, so about the Global Media Monitoring Project, over at the following link, jo.my/GMMP. So make sure to go to that link. You'll be redirected to the page that is all about this interview series, as well as other information concerning the GMMP research project. This is it. Thank you for tuning in and joining Dr. Maria Edström and I in this conversation.